My name is Joy Koo, and I'm the Director of Dissemination and Training for the OpenSim project, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar. Very pleased to welcome today's presenters, Margaret, Raabe, and Ajit Chaudhari from the Ohio State University. Next slide, please. OpenSim is a freely available software application for visualizing musculoskeletal structures and simulating movements of humans and animals. The application includes tools for general-purpose inverse dynamics, optimization to estimate muscle and joint forces, methods to create simulations for motion capture, and tools to analyze and visualize those results. So the first goal of our webinar series is to showcase the cutting-edge research that's being performed with OpenSim. OpenSim is also a growing and geographically diverse community of users. And so the second goal of our webinar series is to provide an easy platform for the OpenSim community to communicate and collaborate. Next slide, please. Now, before we get started, I just want to remind you a few things about the webinar format. Questions are going to be addressed at the end of the presentation using the Q&A panel. And if you need any additional technical help, please consult the guide that's on our website there. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to introduce Margaret and Ajit. Margaret's a PhD candidate in biomedical engineering at the Ohio State University, and she's a graduate research associate in the OSU Sports Biomechanics Laboratory. She obtained her master's degree in biomedical engineering from Ohio State and her undergraduate degree in physics from the College of Worcester. Margaret's research focuses on establishing relationships between core stability and lower extremity loading during running in order to better understand running injury mechanisms and develop improved running injury prevention and rehabilitation protocols. She's been using OpenSim extensively for over 3 years and has attended one of the OpenSim Advanced User and Developer workshops held here at Stanford University. Ajit is an associate professor of physical therapy, orthopedics, mechanical engineering, and biomedical engineering, and has been at the Ohio State University since 2006. His research focuses on the basic question, can we better understand how movement-related injuries and diseases happen by studying the human body as a mechanical system? In particular, Dr. Chaudhari is interested in the role of core stability in the prevention and treatment of injuries across the entire body, the mechanisms behind overuse running and throwing injuries, and the effects of chemotherapy, osteoarthritis, total knee arthroplasty, and lower extremity amputation on gait and balance. He obtained his dual bachelor's degree in biological sciences and mechanical engineering, his master's degree in mechanical engineering, and his doctoral degree in mechanical engineering from Stanford University. We're very excited about their contributions to the OpenSim community and look forward to hearing more about their new model. Margaret? Ajit?
Or who are watching this in the future. So we're going to be talking about investigating jogging biomechanics using the full body lumbar spine model. So our overall outline is first I'm going to give some introduction, talking about our research goals as well as the need for a modified full body OpenSim musculoskeletal model. Then Margaret is going to talk about the model itself, both its development and how we've validated it. And then she's going to talk about the first study that we have done using this model, looking at the biomechanical consequences of running with deep core muscle weakness. So to start, I want to just sort of get all of us on the same page about what core stability is. So the way I like to think about it is to divide it into those two words. The first word is core. So where is your core? If we look at this diagram in the red box, we're delineating the lumbopelvic region. That's another way we might describe it. And you'll notice that it includes the hip joints, the joints of the lumbar spine, and then the muscles that cross those joints and actuate those joints. And when you think about what these muscles and joints do, they provide many different functions for the body. For some activities, they might provide explosive power for rapid movement, such as in jumping or baseball pitching or baseball hitting. But in most activities, including running, what they're doing is more stabilizing that sort of proximal central part of the body to minimize its movement and allow a greater freedom of movement and ability to generate power at the extremities. What about that second word, stability? If we look at these two cases, I think it gives us a good idea of what it is. So the Weeble Wobble on the top is a very stable system. If you push it over, if you throw it across the room, it will end up back at its original state, which is standing straight up. On the other hand, the tightrope walker on the bottom picture is an unstable system. It takes a very small perturbation to push him to a point where he cannot recover that original state. So then our definition here of stability that we use for our research is the ability of the system to return to its original position or state in response to an internal or external perturbation. So the two most important things here are that there's an original position or state and that there's a perturbation. Now it's important to notice that I've got position or state. So this can be either static or dynamic. In the Weeble Wobble case, it's a static state. But if somebody is running in a straight line and they get a perturbation by somebody bumping them, say during a race, what is their ability to return to their original velocity and direction that they were going? That would be a sort of dynamic case of having stability. It's also important to note that our definition does not include the words stiffness or strength. Stability is not the same thing as stiffness or strength. Even though having stiffness or having strength may be important or even necessary components to having this stability, they don't define it. And even if you have incredible strength or the ability to be very stiff, if you don't apply those at the right time with the correct muscle activations, you will not have stability. So that's sort of a more sort of technical scientific definition. If you think about it from coaches or lay people's perspective, core stability comes in a lot of different areas. So an example of baseball pitching, baseball coaches often will tell their players, I want you to tuck your butt under you, which is shown in this sort of top image here. And the idea there is you're holding your core tight so that you can really push off of it with your shoulder and elbow and wrist. Horse riding requires a lot of stability also of the core, and horse riding trainers will often say, I want you to sit tall in the saddle, stabilize that core. Your mom or dad may also have told you don't slouch, as perhaps I'm doing right now as I give this webinar. So those are sort of intuition. And a lot of what we do, especially in physical therapy, at this point with core stability is based on intuition. In the scientific literature, really the best evidence we have is what we call level 5 evidence or expert opinion. So this article, here's the beginning of the abstract of this article by Michael Fredrickson, who is the team physician for the Stanford cross country team. And you know, he talks about the importance of core stability, and he says this stable core is essential. But in many runners, even those at elite levels, this core musculature is not developed fully. So, and he says that, you know, weakness or lack of coordination may lead to less efficient movements, compensatory movement patterns, etc. So what he goes on to do in his article is propose how to include core stability training within an overall training program. And he also, even in this article, proposes several different exercises, which based on his expert opinion and that of his co-author, might be good exercises for distance runners to use to develop their core stability. But looking at this and the fact that it's really based on opinion, we thought, you know, we need to understand scientifically what's going on better. So in particular, with core stability in distance running, we have wanted to answer the questions, well, what do the superficial and the deep core muscles do during distance running? We don't really have much data on what they even do. When are they active? And then if you take it a step further, what if the core muscles were weak, underdeveloped, or fatigued? Lastly, could weak core muscles lead to low back pain in distance running? This is sort of another more specific question because many runners develop low back pain. Now, all of these questions, they're interesting questions, they're important questions to answer, but none of these are questions that we can answer using our typical markered motion capture with force plates in the laboratory, even when we add surface electromyography. So we decided what we needed to do was build a simulation model that will allow us to study running and core stability. There are some published full body models. For example, Hamner's model published in 2010, but they don't have the necessary detail if you're really interested in core stability. They had 3 core muscle groups that were all superficial muscle groups, and they have a rigid head, neck, and torso, so they don't allow any flexion, lateral flexion or twist of the lumbar spine in particular. On the other hand, when you look at torso models, there have been some that have been published that are actually very sophisticated, such as Christophe's model in 2012, but they only include the torso. They don't have the rest of the body. But of course, one of the great benefits of OpenSim is that these models have been made available, and it allows all of us to go in, download those models, and make improvements. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Margaret.
All right, thanks, Ajit. So, since there wasn't currently an OpenSim model that was available that met our research needs, we decided to take advantage of the numerous previously developed OpenSim models which are available on the SimTK website and build our own. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we developed that model as well as validated it. So we developed this full body lumbar spine model by combining 3 previously developed models: Christophe's model of the lumbar spine, Hamner's full body model, and then Arnold's lower limb model, from which we just borrowed the patella and patellar ligament. Going into a little more detail about how we combined each of these models together, we started with Hamner's model as our base model. We then used Notepad++ to edit the model file, and we replaced Hamner's torso with Christophe's torso, as well as the lumbar vertebrae, which are all modeled as individual segments. Lastly, we took the patella and patellar ligament from Arnold's model and input that into the full body lumbar spine model. So whenever you're combining these different models together, it's first important to make sure that they're all scaled to the same size. So that when you combine the different component models together, all the mass and inertial properties are consistent across the different models. Once we did this, there were still some discrepancies that remained regarding the trunk muscle attachment points of the pelvis. And this was because Christophe and Hamner actually used pelvises with slightly different geometries. And since the trunk muscles that we used were from Christophe's model, but the pelvis that we used was from Hamner's model, it turned out that when we combined these 2 models together, the trunk muscles were in improper locations at their attachment point on the pelvis. So we had to take extreme care to make sure that we reattached all these trunk muscle attachment points properly to their original location where they were located in the Christophe model. So once we did all that, we ended up with a full body lumbar spine model you see here. It has 21 segments, 29 degrees of freedom, and 324 musculotendin actuators. The blue surfaces you see in the model are wrapping surfaces, which some of the muscles wrap around to ensure more accurate muscle pads. And the lumbar vertebrae are modeled as 5 individual segments, each connected by a 6-degree freedom joint. We imposed numerous coupled constraints to then reduce the net lumbar motion down to just 3 degrees of freedom, flexion and extension, lateral bending, and axial rotation. And I'm going to switch over to OpenSim now real quickly to show you kind of how all those lumbar vertebrae move together. So we first have flexion and extension here. And then we have lateral bending. And then lastly, we have axial rotation. So this is the first full body lumbar, or the first full body OpenSim model to include all these degrees of freedom in the spine, as well as this level of detail in the trunk musculature. The 8 major muscle groups of the lumbar spine that are in the model can be separated into superficial muscles as well as deep muscles. So starting with the superficial muscles, we have the rectus abdominis, the external obliques, the internal obliques, and the latissimus dorsi. We've got the longissimus thoracis, which actually has a superficial and a deep portion, as well as the iliocostalis lumborum, which also has a superficial and a deep portion. The deep muscles include the quadratus lumborum, the multifidus, and the psoas major. And you notice all of these large muscle groups are modeled as multiple fascicles, which allows them to act in multiple directions. So once you develop a model, it's then important to validate it to make sure that you can produce a dynamic simulation that has physiologically realistic results. So the 3 general stages of model validation that we followed first started out with validating the model properties. So this includes the individual segment as well as muscle properties. Next, you want to validate the muscle function or the strength of the model, which could also be thought of as the moment-generating capacity of the muscles that cross a joint in a model. Lastly, you want to validate a model during a dynamic simulation. For us, we validated this model during running. This was the task that we were most interested in. But you would want to validate a model for the task that you were planning on using your model for. So I'll go into a little more detail now about each of these validation steps, as well as show some of our validation results. So starting with the first step, validating the model properties. This includes validating the body or segment geometries, mass properties, as well as joint definitions. Muscle geometry, which includes the muscle attachment points as well as the muscle moment arms, and then the individual muscle parameters, such as the maximum isometric force property, the tendon slack length property, optimal fiber length, and pennation angle. So when you're validating these, you want to make sure that they all compare pretty well and fall within the variability or the range of experimentally measured values. So for us, most of these properties were actually previously validated and determined by the individual component model developers. They all did extensive literature research to determine these properties and make sure that they were representative of human movement and experimentally measured values. We didn't alter many of these when developing our model. The main change that we made was reattaching these trunk muscle attachment points like I mentioned earlier. So we just needed to revalidate some of the trunk muscle geometry to ensure that these muscles were reattached to their proper locations. So to do this, we compared our models, trunk muscle moment arms, to experimentally measured ones that were obtained using MRI data. Specifically, we were looking at sagittal plane moment arms in the neutral spine position. And we found that all the muscle groups, all the trunk muscle groups, had at least some fascicles with the moment arm within 1 standard deviation of experimentally collected data at most of the joint levels. So you can see this table here is showing 3 of the muscle groups and the moment arms for each of the muscle fascicles that make up those muscle groups at each of the different lumbar joint levels. And the symbols next to each moment arm indicate how well that moment arm compares to the experimentally measured values. The ones highlighted in red fall within 1 standard deviation of the experimental data. And you can see that each of these muscle groups has at least some fascicles that fall within that variability. The reason not all fascicles may fall within that variability could be for a few different reasons. One being that experimentally, when this data is collected, there's 1 moment arm that's collected for an entire muscle group, or that's reported for that muscle group. Whereas in our model, we've got multiple fascicles that make up each muscle group, and each have their own moment arms. Additionally, the spinal curvature of the model may not have perfectly matched the spinal curvature of the participants, which experimental data was collected for. But overall, we thought that this compared pretty well, and the remaining muscle groups all followed this similar trend. So the next step of validating the model, is to validate muscle function, or the strength of the model. So when you're doing this, you want to compare the maximum isometric moment that the model can produce about a given joint to one measured experimentally during a maximal isometric exertion. An individual muscle's maximum isometric moment is calculated in OpenSim as its maximum, the product of its maximum isometric force property and its moment arm at a given joint position. The total maximum isometric joint moment in a model is then the sum of the contribution of each of those individual joint moments from any muscle that can contribute to that moment. So for us, the function of the leg musculature was previously validated by our lower limb model developers. So we focused just on validating the strength of the trunk musculature, focusing on trunk flexion and extension, lateral bending, and axial rotation moments. This data is not extremely abundant in the literature, so we used a custom device that we built in our laboratory to experimentally constrain trunk movement and measure these maximal isometric joint moments in 7 young healthy males at varying joint angles. We compared this data, as well as what data was in the literature, to the maximal moments that could be produced in our model about the L5-S1 joint. So these graphs are showing the normalized maximal trunk joint moments in the model, which is represented as the solid orange line, compared to that experimental data that we collected and which was available in the literature. You can see that the general behavior of the model's moments compares well to experimentally measured data, and the model's moments generally fall within the range of the experimental data as well. So then the last step was to validate our model during simulations. So you want to do this to make sure that your model can produce a successful simulation that's representative of human movement. And when you're doing this, you compare the joint angles and moments, as well as muscle activations that are output from a simulation, to ones that are measured experimentally. Whenever you're creating a simulation, you also want to make sure to do a failure analysis to make sure that that simulation was successful and that the model output fell within the guidelines that the OpenSim team provides as a successful simulation. So depending which tool you're using in OpenSim, you can find in the documentation for that tool a number of different guidelines to evaluate your results, as well as thresholds for different model outputs that indicate whether that simulation was good, okay, or bad. And this is an extremely valuable tool to utilize whenever you're creating a simulation in order to evaluate your results and make sure that that simulation was successful. So we validated our model during a jogging simulation. We compared the joint angles and moments to experimentally reported data, as well as some previously data that was developed using previously developed models. And we also compared the muscle activations in our model to EMG that we simultaneously recorded in our lab, along with the kinematic and kinetic jogging data for a number of trunk as well as lower extremity muscles. So we found that the joint angles and moments of our model compared well to previously reported jogging data. The EMG shown in the graph here also compared pretty well to our muscle activations in the model. You can see that the lower extremity muscle activations compared a bit better to the EMG, which are shown in the bottom 2 rows of this graph, than our trunk muscle activations. One reason for this possibly being that the lower extremity muscles function during running as the primary movers of the limbs, whereas the trunk muscles are functioning to stabilize the upper body. And there's likely quite a few different trunk muscle activation strategies that could be utilized to stabilize the upper body during running, whereas there's probably quite a bit less variability in the lower extremity muscle activation strategies that could be utilized. Also, this simulation was done using static optimization, which solves the model's muscle activations frame by frame. So what this means is that any anticipatory activations that may exist experimentally and show up in the EMG might not show up in the model's muscle activations. So if you want to know more details about our model and how we developed it, as well as more validation results, you can find it in our recently published paper in the journal Biomechanics, as well as on the model's project page on the SimTK website, where you can actually download the model as well as some data that we've provided and experiment with the model yourself. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the first study that we've done using our model, which was investigating the biomechanical consequences of running with deep core muscle weakness. So like I mentioned earlier, the core musculature can be functionally separated into 2 different groups, the superficial muscles and the deep muscles. These deep muscles, which consist of the psoas major, the quadratus lumborum, the multifidus, and the deep fascicles of the erector spinae, which are made up of the longissima thoracis, as well as the iliocausalis lumborum, function primarily during dynamic movements to stabilize the spine. And they do this by contracting and exerting axial compressive loads on the lumbar vertebrae. It's important that these muscles produce enough force to stabilize the spine, but not so much that the spinal structures are overloaded. Both excessive spinal loading and spinal instability have been associated with increased low back pain risk. So it's really important that these muscles are functioning properly in order to ensure optimal health. The role of these deep core muscles has been investigated quite a bit during various lifting tasks, but not so much during athletic tasks like running. So their role during these types of tasks remains not well understood. So the purpose of this study was to identify potential strategies that could be used to compensate for weakness of the deep core musculature during running, and to identify accompanying changes in axial spinal loads. And our goal was that this knowledge would provide insight into the individual contribution of these muscles to spinal loading, as well as potential injuries that may arise in runners suffering this weakness, and ultimately lead to improved training and rehabilitation protocols. So we brought 8 young, healthy adults into our motion capture laboratory, where they jogged over ground at a self-selected comfortable pace. We took that kinematic and kinetic data and input into OpenSim to create individual simulations of each participant jogging. This is the workflow that we followed to create each simulation. We started with our generic full-body lumbar spine model, which we then scaled to be the same size as the participant for which we had experimental data for. Then we performed inverse kinematics to solve for the model's joint angles and positions that best matched the experimental data. Next, we used the residual reduction algorithm tool, or RRA, to estimate the model's joint moments that would produce that motion that we solved for in inverse kinematics. And RRA performs an additional step where the model's motion and mass properties are adjusted slightly to achieve a dynamically consistent set of joint angles and moments in the presence of external forces. Next, we use static optimization to resolve those net joint moments into individual muscle forces and activations at each instant in time. And then lastly, we use the Analyze tool in OpenSim, specifically the joint reaction analysis, to estimate the joint reaction forces on different segments or bodies in the model. So for each participant, we generated one kinematically driven simulation that was a baseline simulation where all the muscles were full strength. And then after that, we generated multiple, also kinematically driven simulations where the deep core muscles, the quadratus lumborum, psoas, multifidus, and deep erector spinae, were weakened either individually or together as a group. And all the results I'm going to be presenting are comparing that baseline simulation for each subject to one where the respective muscle or all the muscles were weakened 100%. We used paired t-tests to determine significant differences between the pre- and post-weakness conditions over just the dominant leg stance phase. And we were looking specifically at peak core muscle forces as well as the peak axial joint reaction force on the individual lumbar vertebrae. So this is an example of one of our simulations. The green arrow represents the ground reaction force, and you can see the muscles in the model activating on a range of 0 to 1, indicated here by colors. So if the muscle is blue, that means its activation is 0, and if it's bright red, that means its activation is 1. So this graph is showing the significant muscle compensations that we found for our different conditions of muscle weakness. We found that the superficial trunk muscles, highlighted in blue here, primarily compensated for almost all conditions of muscle weakness. This graph on the y-axis is showing the percent change in peak muscle force production for each of our core muscles. And we found that the most frequent compensator was the longissimus thoracis, suggesting that this muscle may be at highest risk of injury or fatigue when our deep core muscles are weak. In terms of individual muscle weakness, we found that when the deep erector spinae was weakened on its own, the largest compensations were required. This suggests that since this muscle, which again was made up of the deep portion of the longissimus thoracis as well as iliocostalis lumborum, this suggests that since all these simulations were kinematically driven, that this may be the deep core muscle that plays the largest role in controlling running kinematics. For our spinal loading results, we found that when all the deep core muscles were weakened together, or just the deep erector spinae or multifidus were weakened on their own, the compressive loads on the upper lumbar vertebrae significantly increased, but the loads on the lower lumbar vertebrae significantly decreased, which may suggest that these muscles as a whole together or just individually, these two muscles may function during running, primarily to stabilize the lower lumbar spine, while also minimizing abnormal spinal loading on the upper lumbar vertebra. When just the quadratus lumborum and psoas were weakened on their own, we saw that the compressive loads on all the lumbar vertebrae decreased, suggesting that these two muscles may function during running solely to stabilize the spine. Expectedly, we saw the largest changes in spinal loading occur when all the deep core muscles were weakened together. In this case, we saw a 15% increase in the peak compression on the L1 vertebra. This is not quite as high, but similar to the level of increased loading seen in symptomatic low back pain patients. So from all this, we concluded that individual or total deep core muscle weakness may increase low back pain risk in runners, although further studies are needed to confirm this relationship. The large superficial trunk muscles may be at the highest risk of injury or fatigue with deep core muscle weakness, and the role of these deep core muscles during running may be to stabilize the spine while also minimizing abnormal spinal loading. So our full body lumbar spine models are to further investigate the role of core stability in running in a few different ways. We also are interested in possibly creating EMG-driven simulations of running, as well as experimenting with varying different parameters that are optimized during the jogging simulation. You might be wondering what else you could use this model for. Well, we're pretty confident that it could be used for any task that involves a relatively neutral spine. So, for example, walking, sitting, or a sit-to-stand task, for example. However, if you're interested in simulating a task that involves more spinal range of motion, you may want to validate this model a little further, possibly include more wrapping surfaces in the model that allow those muscle pads to be more accurate in those extreme ranges of motion. So again, just as a reminder, our model, you can find more information about it in our Journal of Biomechanics paper, as well as on the SimTK website under the Models Project page. And that's all we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret and Ajit, for a great talk and a very extremely detailed set of validation experiments there on the model. Margaret, can you double check your headset? At the very end there, your sound switched off, and I'm wondering if something got pulled out.
All right, how does it sound? Is it okay?
Something, can you wiggle the plug or something? Your sound switched about 2 minutes from the end there. Not sure what happened there.
Any better now?
Not really. Maybe you can tweak around with it a little bit more while I give the instructions to participants for participating in the Q&A session. So all the questions are going to be text-based, so you can go to the Q&A box, which should be on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and you should go ahead and type in your question. Make sure you select to ask all panelists so that we can actually all see the question. And so as people are typing in their questions here, I have one question for you guys in regards to your experiment here, where you've got 6 females and 2 males in the experiment, but the model was really based on, if I remember correctly, it's based on a male model. So I was just curious if you saw any differences. I guess there's 2 parts to the questions. One, did you see any differences in kind of results from the female models and simulations you did to the males? And then 2, just more generally, how do you think your model could extend to simulating female subjects?
So we did not specifically investigate any differences between females and males. One of the reasons being that we had 6 females and 2 males, so it's kind of a hard comparison to make with the data that we had. In terms of, I guess, how our model is scaled to women, the pelvis and, the different anatomical properties are scaled when we scale the model. If say you wanted to do any more specific, alter the geometry in specific ways, that's something that we have not experimented with differently, but you could say if you had different imaging, or say the spinal curvature, that's something we're interested in, or maybe interested in doing eventually, is in all these subjects, the spinal curvature of the model was the same. And so it's just an example of how maybe eventually we might want to get to the point where you could kind of make that a little bit more subject specific, and perhaps you could do something when simulating females instead of males as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. So that answers my question. I guess in terms, so you talked about the geometry. In terms of the actual muscle properties, is it known what, are there differences in the muscle properties themselves? Gender?
I do not know off the top of my head, but I would imagine that if that data is out there, you could definitely make that more subject specific in the model. You can alter a number of muscle properties for each of the muscle fascicles in the model. So if you had that data, I think that is something you definitely could do.
Great. So first question from the audience, Clement Favier says, great talk. Do you know if the kinematic constraints that are used for the spine motion have any effect on the muscle force estimation during static optimization?
I do not know that off the top of my head. Christophe actually, in his paper, determined how all those constraints were kind of coupled together, and so I would reference the listeners to that paper if they wanted to know a little bit more detail about the specific constraints and how everything is coupled together. In terms of static optimization, it is minimizing the sum of the squared muscle activation to kind of resolve those net joint moments into individual muscle forces and activations. So I'm not sure that those constraints would affect that too much.
Okay. Another question related to the kinematic constraints. This one's coming from Dario Cazala, and he says, by using the kinematic constraints, you're decreasing the number of degrees of freedom of the spine, but you increase the redundancy problem for the calculation of individual trunk muscle activation. And he wants to know, did you use synergies or specific objective functions to improve the individual muscle activation calculations?
In what I presented here, I did not use any synergies, although that is something that we've definitely thought about and have experimented with a little bit. Cat Steele just made available a synergy tool in OpenSim where you could use to kind of constrain, say maybe we could constrain all the muscle fascicles for one muscle group to activate together. And that's something that we have thought about, but we haven't done too much with yet, since everything that we're doing right now is pretty exploratory, and we didn't want to constrain anything too much quite yet, but it's definitely a valuable tool and something that we're interested in doing in the future.
Great. So we've got more questions coming. Keep them coming. This one's from Michelle Baldoni, and Michelle says, thanks for the presentation. Would it be possible to implement intervertebral disc stiffness in the lumbar joint definition in OpenSim and in your model to simulate the compression of the discs? And if yes, how could that be done?
Well, I think, this is just off the top of my head, but if you were to do that, I think you would need to model each of the discs kind of as their own segment or their own body of some sort. I'm not aware of an OpenSim model that has done this yet, so I'm not sure exactly how it would be done, but that is definitely something worth possibly doing in the future, because of course that could affect, you know, the spinal loads, and it's definitely more realistic if we have those in the model. Great.
Another question, this one from Erica Bocage Govra. again, thank you for a great presentation. And Erica's wondering if you looked at the moments at the L5-S1 during, or have you looked at the moments at L5-S1 during forward flexion during the validation process? And if so, how did the values for that compare to those reported in the literature?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, we did, I could switch back to those graphs real quick here. We did look at trunk flexion, the maximal trunk flexion moment about the L5-S1 joint when we were validating it. Here you can see it's graph D. And this is the data that we collected, as well as a couple papers that had published some data in the literature. And you can see that that general behavior of the model, that moment, behavior of that moment, does compare pretty well and falls right within that range of the experimentally measured data.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Dario. Dario asked, why didn't you use CMC like in Hamner's study? And he wonders, does CMC crash since the model is very complex?
Yeah, that's a great question. So initially we wanted to use CMC, but with the added detail in the model, it increases the computational cost extremely. So it takes quite a bit. We have played around with CMC a little bit. For us, one stance phase takes about a week to run through the command line. So it would crash if you tried to run it just through the OpenSim GUI. But it will run. It's just an extremely high computational cost that we didn't really think was necessary at this point in our research. But it is something that you, as any listener or any user, could do themselves. You can download our model and play with it yourself. And it definitely adds some benefit with the path static optimization because it allows for those anticipatory activations to be estimated as well.
Thanks, Margaret. So actually a follow-up question to that is, I think it's great that you've added all this complexity to really capture a lot of details. And what I'm wondering now is kind of related to that computation time is now that you've run the study and gotten some ideas about what's important and what's not, are there things you might actually consider removing from the model for the specific study that you did with the jogging?
For us, I wouldn't necessarily want to remove anything, but maybe implementing some of these synergy constraints, essentially reducing the number of individual muscle kind of activations and the calculations that need to be done for that would likely reduce the computational time a bit. And once we had data that kind of supported how exactly we wanted to constrain those trunk muscles, I think that's something that we would do.
Okay. That's helpful to get your input on that. More questions, another one from Erica. She wants to know, where were the markers placed on the lumbar spine during data collection to track its motion?
So we just used the traditional plug-in gait marker set on the upper body, which, as you may know, isn't super specific to the lumbar spine. If you were doing a study where that specific movement is extremely important to you, I think you would definitely want to use a more detailed marker set. But for us, that is our traditional marker set that we use with our jogging data, so that's kind of where we started. And possibly going forward, we could think about making it more detailed, but right now we just use the traditional plug-in gait marker set.
Actually, if I could jump in here a little bit, this is Ajit. The other thing to think about is with our model, since we have all those coupling constraints, really having markers on the thoracic spine will fully define how the lumbar spine will move in this model, right? Because you only have these 3 degrees of freedom for basically the whole torso.
All right. So Erica, hopefully that addresses your question. If not, feel free to type in another question. We're going to take another question here from Clement Favier, who says that if he heard correctly, the bone geometries of the lower limb and the lumbar spine are actually from the different data sets. And so he's wondering, how did you decide on the position of the lumbosacral joint relative to the hip joint? And does that lumbosacral joint location have any impact on the joint reaction forces?
Yeah, so when we combined these models together, that we used the joint definition that Christophe originally used. I did notice that when I combined them that it was a little off. So the pelvis, like the iliac crest level, normally matches up with about like the L4, L5 lumbar level, and that didn't match perfectly, so I adjusted that slightly to match. And we haven't done really too much validation past that. I think once we kind of set that joint and then we did the rest of our validation, if there was some issue, we would have seen that, especially since we were looking at these joint moments about that L5S1 joint. So that's kind of how we did it. We basically just used the definition that Christophe used and then slightly adjusted it based on the different pelvis geometry that was in Hamner's model.
And then the follow-up question there was, does that joint location actually have any impact on the joint reaction forces?
It might, if you're looking at the joint reaction force on that S1 vertebra. But that internal load is calculated based off of the kinematics as well as the muscle forces and activations in the model. So I wouldn't expect that it would be too extremely sensitive to that joint definition.
Great. Well, thank you all for, oh, hold on a second. I think we had a question pop up in another window here. Let me see. Okay, so I'll take this one last question and then we'll wrap up. This is from Arpit Google. And Arpit says, thanks for the webinar. Can we model the models, I guess, can we use the models for stresses generated in the leg as a preparation for landing in the gait cycle?
Let's see, that's a good question. I think based on the tools that are available in OpenSim, I'm not sure if there's one where you can directly calculate stress. You can definitely get those internal joint loads using the joint reaction analysis. That's a good question, though. That's something I would need to look into a little bit further and see if maybe anyone else has done that yet in OpenSim. I'm not aware off the top of my head, though.
All right, and with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you all for the many great questions and the great discussion, and thank you, Ajit and Margaret, for sharing this model with us and telling us more about it. Can you go on to the next slide? Keep on going. So OpenSim and the webinar series are supported by several grants from the NIH, including the grant that funds our National Center for Simulation and Rehabilitation Research. We're also supported by the DARPA Warrior Web effort. Next slide. Information about the center, upcoming events, and other resources for the OpenSim community are available at our website. We look forward to seeing you at future events and ask that you take a few moments and fill out the survey that appears after this webinar ends. This will help us improve the webinars and choose upcoming projects. So thank you all again for participating, and we hope you'll continue to stay involved with OpenSim.